A white knight stands alone in a viper pit, his armor gleaming as serpents coil at his feet. Dark Sister, the ancient Valyrian steel blade, rests in his hands, but against these enemies, even legendary steel means nothing. A forbidden love burns in silence through the halls of the Red Keep, where duty and desire wage their eternal war. A brother who becomes a monster, a sister who suffers in silence. And between them, a knight sworn to protect them both, the one he despises and the other he loves beyond reason. They called him the Dragonknight. They called him the greatest warrior Westeros ever knew. They said he never lost a battle, never broke a vow, never wavered in his honor. But the songs don't tell you about the tears he shed in darkness. They don't tell you about the woman he could never have, the son he might never claim, the king he died protecting, though that king made his life a living hell. This is the story of Prince Aemon Targaryen, the man who wielded Dark Sister with unmatched skill, the Lord Commander who championed his sister's honor in trial by combat, the mystery knight called the Knight of Tears who defied a king for love, the legend who walked into a snake pit and emerged carrying a poisoned king on his back. But here's what the songs won't tell you. Did he break his sacred vows? Was the heir to the Iron Throne actually his bastard son? And when he died defending the brother who tormented him, was it honor that drove him or something far more tragic? Tonight we unravel the complete story of the greatest knight who ever lived and discover why his legend came at the cost of everything he held dear. Before we begin this epic journey through one of the most tragic and beautiful stories in Westerosi history, I need to mention something. Nearly 84% of you watching right now haven't subscribed yet. If you enjoy these deep dives into the legends of ice and fire, hitting that subscribe button truly helps this channel grow and lets me bring you more stories like this one. So take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I create here. And here's something I always love. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your world right now. Seriously, it blows my mind every time I see viewers from different corners of the globe all gathered here for the same story. Now dim the lights, settle into your blanket. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background sound, and let's begin the remarkable tale of Aemon the Dragonknight together. Our story begins on the eve of Smith's Day in the year 136 after Aegon's conquest. In the Red Keep of King's Landing, Lady Lara Rogar of Lys gave birth to her second son. Prince Viserys Targaryen, the future king, placed a dragon's egg in the infant's cradle. Following the ancient tradition of House Targaryen, they named him Aemon. The realm rejoiced at his birth. Crowds gathered outside the Red Keep, hoping for a glimpse of the new prince. When King Jaehaerys held the baby aloft from the ramparts, a roar went up so loud it could allegedly be heard across the narrow sea. But not everyone celebrated. In the royal nursery, young Prince Aegon, barely a year old himself, was found by his mother doing something disturbing. He was hitting the newborn Aemon with Aemon's own dragon egg. It was the first sign of the jealousy and cruelty that would define their relationship forever. Aemon was born into a time still recovering from the Dance of Dragons, that brutal civil war that had nearly destroyed House Targaryen just decades before. His father Viserys was the son of Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen and Prince Daemon Targaryen, survivors of that terrible conflict. The memory of dragon fighting dragon, brother against sister, still haunted the realm. The young prince grew quickly, and from his earliest days it was clear he was special. As an infant he was large, strong, and beautiful, with the classic Valyrian features, silver gold hair, and purple eyes that marked him as dragon-blooded. But unlike his older brother Aegon, Aemon possessed something rare, a gentle piety and natural nobility of spirit. In 138, 2 years after Aemon's birth, Lady Lara gave them a sister, Princess Nerys, delicate and devout, would become the most important person in Aemon's life, though neither could know it yet. The three children of Viserys could not have been more different. Aegon was cruel, jealous, and lustful even as a child. Naedris was fragile, pious, and kind. And Aemon was everything a prince should be: strong, noble, gifted in arms, and possessed of an honor that would define and ultimately destroy him. But in 139, tragedy struck the young family. Lady Lara Rogar, their mother, abandoned them. She left King's Landing and returned to Lys, unable to bear life at the Westerosi court any longer. She left behind 3 children, the oldest barely 4 years old. The experience-hardened Prince Viserys made him stern and calculating, and it left 3 siblings to find comfort in each other. Aemon and Daenerys grew inseparable. While Aegon bullied and tormented them both, the younger siblings formed a bond that went deeper than ordinary sibling affection. In the training yards of the Red Keep, young Aemon began to show extraordinary promise with sword and lance. He outshone every boy his age, and many older. His natural talent with weapons became legendary even in childhood. By the time Aemon reached his teenage years, he had grown tall and powerful, more than 6 feet of lean muscle and deadly grace. He trained constantly, pushing himself to perfection in every martial art. Jousting, swordplay, archery, strategy. In all of it he excelled far beyond his brother Aegon, and the comparison only deepened Aegon's hatred. The Maesters who tutored the royal children noted something remarkable. While Aegon showed cunning and ambition, and Naedris showed devotion to the faith, Aemon showed something rarer. He showed genuine goodness. A desire to be better, to serve, to protect. Even then, the seeds of the legend were being planted. But so were the seeds of tragedy. Because as Aemon and Naedris grew from children into young adults, their bond deepened into something neither could acknowledge. In a family where brothers wed sisters, where Targaryen married Targaryen to keep the blood pure, this should have been natural, expected even. But their father Viserys had other plans, and those plans would set in motion a tragedy that would echo through history, fuel civil wars, and ultimately define what it meant to be the greatest knight who ever lived. The boy who would become the Dragonknight was growing up in the shadow of his brother's cruelty, standing between that cruelty and the sister he loved more than life itself. Soon he would have to make a choice, and that choice would trap him in an impossible cage of honor for the rest of his days. The bond between Aemon and Daenerys transcended everything their world understood about siblings. They were each other's refuge in a court that grew more dangerous with each passing year. While Aegon indulged in every vice the Red Keep could offer, his younger brother and sister found solace in prayer, in poetry, in the quiet gardens where they could escape the ugliness of their eldest brother's world. Daenerys was different from other Targaryen princesses, delicate as spun glass, with a devotion to the Seven that bordered on the mystical. She dreamed of joining the faith, of becoming a scepter, and dedicating her life to prayer and service. She wanted purity in a world that seemed determined to corrupt everything it touched. Aemon understood her in ways no one else could. When she spoke of her faith, he listened with genuine reverence. When she expressed her fears about the future, he became her shield. And somewhere in those stolen moments, something shifted. The love between siblings became something deeper, more dangerous, more impossible. They both knew what was happening. They both understood the cruel reality of their situation. In any other noble house in Westeros, their feelings would be forbidden, wrong, unthinkable. But they were Targaryens. Their grandfather had married his sister. Their ancestors had wed brother to sister for generations to keep the bloodline pure. This should have been acceptable. But Prince Viserys had made his decision. The realm needed stability, the crown needed alliances, and he had already decided Daenerys' fate. In the year 153 after Aegon's conquest, when Naerys was just 15 and Aemon 17, their father commanded what would destroy them both. Aegon and Naerys would marry, the eldest son and the youngest daughter bound together to ensure the line of succession remained clear. The announcement shattered something fundamental in the Red Keep. Everyone knew how Aegon treated women. Everyone knew his appetites, his cruelty, his complete lack of respect for anything sacred. And everyone knew that gentle, pious Naerys would suffer under his hand. Most of all, Aemon knew. The wedding took place with all the grandeur House Targaryen could muster. The Great Sept witnessed the union of Prince Aegon and Princess Naerys before gods and men. And according to the histories, both bride and groom's younger brother was seen weeping that day. The official chronicles say that Aemon argued with Aegon at the wedding feast, though about what, the records don't specify. They say that Naerys cried during the bedding ceremony, that traditional ritual where guests escort the bride to the marriage bed. They say it was one of the saddest royal weddings anyone could remember. For Aemon, it was the end of everything he'd hoped for without ever letting himself truly hope. He had two choices before him. He could remain at court, watching the woman he loved suffer daily under his brother's cruelty. He could build a life, marry some other noble lady, father children who would never be hers, and slowly die inside while pretending everything was fine. Or he could take the White, the King's Guard. The Brotherhood of 7 knights sworn to defend the king and royal family with their lives, sworn to hold no lands, take no wives, father no children, sworn to give up everything for duty and honor. It meant giving up any chance of a normal life. It meant watching over Naerys as his brother's wife, protecting her, but never claiming her. It meant serving Aegon, the man he despised more than anyone in the world. But it also meant staying close to her. It meant having a purpose, a reason to endure, and perhaps in some twisted way, it meant that if he couldn't have her, at least no one else would have him. Shortly after the wedding, Aemon approached his uncle, King Aegon III, and requested admission to the King's Guard. He was only 17, one of the youngest candidates ever considered. But his skill with weapons was already legendary. His honor was unquestioned, and the king needed strong swords to protect the crown. The ceremony took place in the throne room. Aemon knelt before the Iron Throne and spoke the ancient vows: to wear no crowns and win no glory, to take no wife and hold no lands, to guard the king's secrets and defend his name, to give his life if need be. When he rose, he wore the white cloak, and the king presented him with a blade worthy of his skill. Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel sword of Queen Visenya Targaryen, one of the conquerors. The blade had passed through many hands since Visenya's death, but in Aemon's grip it found its truest master since the conqueror's sister herself. He commissioned a helm for himself, a great helm with a 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen wrought in white gold. When he wore it in tournaments, the crowd would roar. The Dragonknight had arrived. But the armor hid the truth. The white cloak covered the pain, because every day Aemon had to watch Aegon treat Naerys with casual cruelty. Every night he had to stand guard outside chambers where his brother bedded the woman Aemon loved. Every moment of every day he lived with the knowledge that he had chosen this cage himself. The vows gave him purpose. They gave him honor. They gave him a reason to stay close to Naerys without it being questioned. But they also locked him into an impossible situation that would define the rest of his life. Sir Aemon Targaryen of the King's Guard, the Dragonknight, the greatest warrior of his generation, and the most heartbroken man in the 7 kingdoms. He was 17 years old, and his life of quiet suffering had only just begun. Dark Sister hung at his hip, ready to defend the crown, but no sword could defend him from what he'd chosen. No blade could cut through the cage of honor he'd built around himself. And in the years to come, that cage would grow smaller and tighter until there was barely room left to breathe. Aemon threw himself into his duties with an intensity that bordered on obsession. If he couldn't have the life he wanted, he would be the perfect embodiment of the life he'd chosen. Every morning before dawn, he was in the training yard. Every tournament that came to King's Landing, he entered and dominated. Dark Sister became an extension of his will, the Valyrian steel moving through the air like liquid lightning. The realm took notice. Knights came from across Westeros, hoping to test themselves against the Dragonknight, and all of them left with new respect for his abilities. He was more than skilled. He was transcendent. The way he fought looked less like combat, and more like art, deadly and beautiful in equal measure. His reputation grew with each passing year. Never unhorsed in the joust, never bested in single combat. The White Cloak had many legendary members throughout history, but Aemon was quickly becoming the standard against which all others would be measured. By his mid-20s, he had risen to Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, the highest position a knight could achieve. He commanded 6 other knights, the finest warriors in the 7 kingdoms, all sworn to the same impossible vows he'd taken, and he served his king with absolute dedication. But the irony cut deep every single day. As Lord Commander, he was closer than ever to the royal family, closer to Aegon, closer to Naerys, close enough to see every moment of her suffering, close enough to hear every cruel word his brother spoke to her, and absolutely powerless to stop any of it. Then came the year 157, and everything changed. Young King Daeron I, called the Young Dragon, ascended the throne at just 14 years old, and he had a dream that would reshape the realm. Dorne, the only kingdom that had resisted Aegon the Conqueror, the realm that even dragons couldn't subdue. For a century and a half, the Dornish had remained independent, a constant reminder that Targaryen power had limits. Daeron meant to finish what his ancestors started. The conquest of Dorne began with brilliant strategy. While the Dornish focused their armies in the mountain passes, expecting a traditional invasion, Admiral Arlen Oakenfist sailed the royal fleet around to the eastern coast. They landed near the Greenblood River, struck at the heart of Dorne, while the armies were deployed west, and conquered the kingdom in a single summer. It was a stunning victory. The young dragon had achieved what Aegon the Conqueror with 3 dragons could not, and Aemon had been there for all of it, leading charges, winning single combats, proving that the Dragon Knight was more than just a tournament champion. During one battle, a Dornish archer drew on King Daeron from an elevated position. The angle was perfect, the king was exposed, the arrow flew true, its tip gleaming with poison. Aemon saw it. For just a fraction of a heartbeat, he had a choice. Then his body moved before his mind could finish the thought. He threw himself between the arrow and his king. The poison tip struck his armor, penetrated just enough to deliver its venom into his bloodstream. They carried him from the field as the poison burned through his veins. The Maesters weren't sure he would survive. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness, fighting a battle Dark Sister couldn't help him win. But Aemon's will proved as strong as his sword arm. Slowly, agonizingly, he recovered. The moment he could stand, he demanded to return to Dorne. The Maesters protested. Naerys, hearing of his injury, sent desperate messages begging him to stay in King's Landing until fully healed. But Aemon couldn't remain idle while his king was still in danger. He rode south, still weak, still recovering, but determined to finish what they'd started. Upon his return, he faced a Dornish champion in single combat before both armies. The songs still remember that duel. Despite his weakened state, despite the lingering effects of the poison, Aemon defeated the champion with such skill that even the Dornish knights roared their approval. It was the kind of victory that becomes legend. Dorne, was conquered. King Daron installed garrisons throughout the kingdom, and for a brief moment it seemed the impossible had been achieved. Then the Dornish taught the dragon a lesson about the difference between conquest and submission. The occupation became a nightmare. Dornish resistance fighters attacked supply lines. They poisoned wells. They ambushed patrols. They turned their conquered kingdom into a maze of death for the occupying forces. Traditional warfare meant nothing against an enemy who refused to fight traditionally. Even the Dragonknight, for all his skill, couldn't fight shadows. Daron lost 10,000 men taking Dorne. Over the next 3 years he lost 40 to 50,000 more trying to hold it. The glorious conquest turned into a bleeding wound that drained the realm's strength. Then came the betrayal that would change everything. In the year 161, King Daron received word that Dornish lords wanted to negotiate peace. They asked for a meeting under a peace banner, that sacred symbol that guaranteed safety for all parties. Daron agreed. He took 5 of his Kingsguard, including Aemon, and rode to meet the Dornish delegation. It was a trap. The moment they arrived, the Dornish attacked. Peace banner or not, they had decided that killing the young dragon was worth any dishonor. Swords came out, men screamed, blood soaked the Dornish sand. 3 Kingsguard died fighting, their white cloaks turning red as they gave their lives defending their king. 1 knight yielded a shame that would follow him forever, and Aemon fought like a demon, Dark Sister taking 2 Dornish lives, even as more warriors overwhelmed him. King Daron died at 18 years old, his brilliant conquest undone by treachery, and Aemon, wounded and outnumbered, was taken prisoner. They stripped him of his armor, of his dignity, of everything but his life. And then they gave him to Lord Wull of Wollel, who had a special punishment prepared. They built a cage, a crow cage, barely large enough for a man to crouch inside. They suspended it above a pit, and into that pit they put vipers, dozens of venomous snakes writhing beneath him. The sun scorched him by day. The cold bit him at night, and always the snakes waited below. Lord Commander Aemon Targaryen, the Dragonknight, the greatest knight in Westeros, hung naked in a cage while vipers hissed beneath him, and his enemies wagered on how long he would last. It was the lowest moment of his life, but his rescue would become one of the most legendary tales in all of Westerosi history. When news reached King's Landing that Daron had been killed and Aemon captured, the realm reeled. The young dragon was dead. The conquest had failed, and the greatest knight alive was in the hands of enemies known for their creative cruelty. Daron's younger brother ascended the throne as Balor I, where Daron had been a warrior king. Brilliant and bold, Balor was something entirely different. He was pious beyond reason, devoted to the faith of the Seven, with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. He fasted until he could barely stand. He had visions he claimed came from the gods themselves. And his first act as king was to make peace with Dorne. The lords of Westeros demanded vengeance. The people cried out for war. But Balor refused. He would not spill more blood. He would not continue the cycle of violence. Instead, he would walk to Dorne unarmed and negotiate peace through faith alone. They thought he was mad. Perhaps he was, but mad or not, King Balor I began walking south, not riding, walking, and not in boots, but barefoot. He walked the Boneway, that treacherous mountain pass between Dorne and the Stormlands, with nothing but his faith to protect him. Somehow, impossibly, he made it to Sunspear. The Prince of Dorne, faced with this strange king who came in peace rather than war, agreed to negotiate. They hammered out terms. Dorne would remain independent but in peace with the crown. The hostages taken during the war would be exchanged, and Aemon would be released. But Lord Weil of Weil, who held the Dragonknight, decided to make things interesting. When Baelor arrived to collect his cousin, Weil honored the letter of the agreement. He would release Aemon, but he wouldn't make it easy. He gave Baelor the key to the cage and an invitation to use it. The cage still hung over the viper pit. If the Holy King wanted his knight, he could walk into the snakes to get him. Aemon, hanging in that cage after weeks of torment, saw his cousin arrive. He saw the pit full of vipers between them, and he begged Baelor to leave, to go to Blackhaven or Storm's End, to get help, to send soldiers with ropes and tools. Don't walk into the pit. Don't risk everything for one night, even if that knight is your cousin. Baelor looked at the vipers. He looked at Aemon, and he smiled. The gods would protect him, he said. The Seven would not let him come to harm while performing an act of mercy. Then King Baelor the Blessed walked into a pit full of venomous snakes. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. The singers claim the vipers bowed their heads before the Holy King. They say the snakes recognized divine protection and refused to strike him. They say Baelor walked through the pit untouched, opened the cage, and led Aemon to safety, while the serpents parted like the sea before a prophet. The Meisters tell a different version. They say Baelor was bitten 6 times crossing to the cage, that venom pumped into his body with each step, but he kept walking through faith or madness or both. The Dornish, who watched the whole thing, claim the king was bitten 50 times, that he should have died 3 steps into the pit but somehow remained standing long enough to reach the cage. The truth is probably somewhere between these accounts. But this much is certain. Baelor reached the cage. He unlocked it with hands that were shaking from venom or terror or religious ecstasy. And as he started to collapse, Aemon burst through the door and caught him. The Wiles and their men watched from above, placing bets on whether either man would make it out alive. Some cruel part of them enjoyed the spectacle. A religious fanatic king and a legendary knight trapped in a snake pit together, one poisoned, both desperate. Aemon couldn't carry Baelor back through the pit. There was no path, no safe route, and his cousin was already slipping into unconsciousness from the venom. So he did the only thing possible. He climbed. With his king draped across his shoulders, weak from his own captivity, Aemon climbed the outside of the cage, hand over hand finding grips on metal bars never meant to be scaled. Below them the vipers struck at the air. Above them the Dornish lords watched in fascination, and Aemon climbed. When he reached the top, when he finally pulled both himself and Baelor over the edge to safety, even the Wiles had to acknowledge what they'd witnessed. It was impossible. It should have killed them both. But somehow the Holy King and the perfect knight had survived. Then began a different kind of nightmare. Baelor fell into a coma, the venom overwhelming his system. Aemon barely recovered from his own ordeal, carried the king on his back. He walked for miles, until a village septon found them, gave Aemon clothes and a donkey to transport the unconscious king. They made it to Blackhaven, where the local maester did what he could, then to Storm's End for better care. But Baelor remained lost to the world, hovering between life and death, his body fighting a battle against venom that should have killed him in the pit. For 6 months, Baelor lay unconscious while his uncle Viserys ruled as Hand of the King. And Aemon stayed nearby when he could, recovered his strength, reclaimed Dark Sister, and wondered if his rescue had cost the realm its king. But Baelor survived. He woke muttering prayers, weak as a newborn, but alive. The faith called it a miracle, the maesters called it inexplicable, and the story spread across Westeros. The king who walked through vipers, the knight who climbed from hell with his king on his back. Aemon's legend grew even larger, but so did the weight he carried. Another king saved, another duty fulfilled, another day of perfect service to a crown that could never give him what he truly wanted. He returned to King's Landing to resume his post, And there, waiting in the Red Keep, was Nabris, still suffering under Aegon's cruelty, still the woman he couldn't have. The cage in Dawn had been temporary. The cage of his vows was eternal. Baudelaur's reign became something Westeros had never experienced before. Where other kings led armies or hosted grand tournaments, Baudelaur built septs and fasted until his ribs showed through his skin. He had visions he claimed came directly from the 7 religious experiences so intense they left him trembling and weak for days afterward. He locked his sisters away in a tower he called the Maiden Vault, claiming he was protecting their virtue from the corrupting influences of court. The realm whispered that he feared his own desires, that his piety demanded he remove temptation entirely, rather than simply resist it. His own wife remained locked away while he dedicated himself to celibacy and prayer. For a warrior like Aemon, serving this king required a different kind of strength. There were no more battles to fight, no more military campaigns to plan. Instead, he protected a king who spent more time on his knees in prayer than on the throne, dispensing justice. He stood guard outside septs while Baelor communed with the gods for hours. He watched this strange, devout, possibly mad king try to reshape Westeros into his vision of a holy kingdom. But Baelor's piety did bring one mercy. His religious fervor meant the court became somewhat quieter, more restrained. Aegon, now the crown prince waiting for his turn at the throne, found his behavior slightly curtailed by a king who frowned on open debauchery. It wasn't much, but it gave Naerys some breathing room. Still, Aegon remained Aegon. His cruelty toward his wife continued behind closed doors. He paraded mistresses through court with barely concealed contempt for his marriage vows, and he grew more resentful of his younger brother with each passing year. The comparison between them became impossible to ignore. Aemon, the perfect knight, beloved by the realm, celebrated in songs, holding the highest position the Kingsguard could offer, and Aegon, the heir to the throne, known for his appetites and cruelty, respected by no one despite his future crown. It came to a head during a tournament. Baelor reluctantly allowed. Aegon commanded his brother not to participate. He wanted to win himself, wanted the glory of victory without the Dragonknight, making him look inadequate by comparison. More importantly, he planned to crown his current mistress as Queen of Love and Beauty, that symbolic honor given to the most worthy lady present. It was a deliberate insult to Naerys. The queen would have to sit there while her husband publicly honored his mistress over her. The entire realm would witness the humiliation, and there was nothing she could do about it. Except that Aemon had other plans. On the day of the tournament, a mystery knight appeared. His armor bore no house sigils, no identifying marks. His shield was plain, but his skill was unmistakable. He entered the lists and began defeating every opponent with effortless grace. The crowd buzzed with speculation. Who was this unknown knight? Some claimed he must be a legendary warrior traveling incognito. Others thought perhaps a foreign champion seeking glory in Westeros. The betting went wild as he advanced through each round. Aegon competed as well, and he fought adequately. But every time he won a match, the Mystery Knight's next victory overshadowed it. The stranger moved through the tournament like a force of nature, his lance striking true every time, his swordwork precise and devastating. When the final tilt came, the Mystery Knight faced the last opponent standing between him and victory. The lance shattered against shield, the combat turned to swords, and within moments, it was over. The Mystery Knight had won the tournament. According to tradition, the victor would crown the Queen of Love and Beauty, selecting the worthiest lady present to receive that symbolic honor. The entire court held its breath. Aegon leaned forward, ready to see his mistress crowned and his wife humiliated. The Mystery Knight removed his helm. Silver hair spilled out, Purple eyes scanned the crowd, and Ser Aemon Targaryen, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, stood revealed before the realm. Aegon's face went crimson with rage. He had explicitly forbidden his brother from entering. But Aemon had defied him, competed in disguise, and won the tournament through pure skill. There was nothing Aegon could do about it now without looking even worse. Aemon approached the royal box. He carried the crown of winter roses traditionally given to the Queen of Love and Beauty, and he walked past Aegon's mistress without a glance, past the noble women who'd been hoping for the honor, straight to his sister. He placed the crown on Nerys's head. She was Queen of Love and Beauty by right of marriage, but now she was also Queen of Love and Beauty by right of the realm's greatest knight, choosing her above all others. The crowd roared approval. They'd seen the insult Aegon planned, and they loved watching it thwarted. But there was something else in that moment, something everyone saw but few dared speak about. The way Aemon looked at Nerys as he crowned her. The tears that gave him his disguise's name, the Night of Tears glistening in his eyes. The way she looked back at him with gratitude and something deeper, something that shouldn't exist between siblings. The tournament became legend. Songs spread across Westeros about the Night of Tears who defied a prince to honor a queen. But those same songs carried whispers about forbidden love, about a knight too devoted to his sister, about a bond that seemed to transcend duty. Aegon never forgave the humiliation. His hatred for Aemon, already deep, became something darker and more dangerous. He began speaking more openly about his suspicions, about his belief that his wife and brother had betrayed him. The seeds of doubt he planted would eventually grow into something that threatened the entire realm. But Daemon's reign continued for another few years, growing stranger as his health declined from constant fasting. When he died in 171, poisoned by tainted food or possibly by his uncle Viserys trying to spare the realm further embarrassment, the crown passed to Viserys II. Aemon's father was king, and Aemon knew exactly what that meant. When Viserys died, the throne would go to Aegon, his brother, his enemy. The man who made Nerys's life a waking nightmare would become king. And Aemon would be sworn to serve him until death. Viserys II took the throne at 49 years old, and the realm breathed a collective sigh of relief. Here at last was a competent king. He'd served as hand through the reigns of his brother and both his nephews, effectively running the kingdom while they brooded, warred, or prayed. Now he could finally implement policy without working around a king's eccentricities. For Aemon, serving his father brought its own complications. The professional distance between king and Kingsguard became harder to maintain when the king was the man who'd raised you, who knew your weaknesses and strengths better than anyone. Viserys treated his son with respect but demanded absolute perfection in return. The Dragonknight standards were already impossibly high. His father's expectations pushed them higher still. But Viserys's reign would be brief. Just over a year after taking the throne, he died suddenly. Some claimed natural causes from the stress of decades spent holding the realm together. Others whispered darker theories about poison, about his eldest son growing impatient for his inheritance. Whether Aegon murdered their father or simply benefited from fortunate timing, the result was the same. In 172, Aegon IV took the Iron Throne, and Westeros learned what it meant to be ruled by appetite rather than wisdom. The transformation was immediate. Where Viserys had been measured and careful, Aegon was excessive in everything. He ate until he could barely walk. He drank until he stumbled, and his treatment of women became so notorious that the realm eventually named him Aegon the Unworthy, a title he earned a dozen times over. For Nerys, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last the rest of her life. As queen, she had no escape from her husband's cruelty. He paraded mistresses before her daily. He spoke openly about his contempt for her piety, her fragility, her refusal to embrace the same debauchery he wallowed in. And he questioned constantly whether Prince Daron, their son, was truly his. The boy had been born years earlier during Aegon's time as crown prince. Nyris had nearly died, bringing him into the world. The pregnancy and birth had weakened her already delicate constitution, and for days afterward, the Meisters weren't certain she would survive. When she finally recovered enough to sit up, to hold her baby, she looked at her son with a mix of love and exhaustion that suggested childbirth had taken something from her she would never fully regain. Prince Daron was everything his father was not. Gentle where Aegon was cruel, thoughtful where his father was impulsive, honorable where Aegon was shameless. The boy showed early signs of the wisdom that would later earn him the name Daron the Good. But that very goodness, that complete lack of resemblance to Aegon's character, fueled the king's suspicions. Aegon claimed loudly, and often, that Daron must be a bastard, that his wife and brother had betrayed him, that the heir to the Iron Throne was actually the son of the Dragonknight, rather than the king. He used these accusations as weapons, wielding them whenever Nerys displeased him, or Aemon's presence reminded him of his own inadequacies. The whispers spread through court like fever. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a cruel husband looking for excuses to torment his wife. Others pointed to the timing, to Aemon's devotion to both Nerys and young Daron, to the boy's complete lack of resemblance to Aegon's nature. The truth became impossible to determine, because everyone's beliefs aligned with their existing loyalties. A man never defended himself publicly. How could he? To deny the accusations too strongly might suggest guilt. To ignore them completely seemed like an admission, so he remained silent and let people think what they would. He served his king. He protected the royal family. He trained young Daron in arms and honor, and he watched Nerys suffer daily. The relationship between Aemon and his nephew, or possibly his son, was undeniably close. When Daron was old enough to train, it was Aemon who taught him swordplay. When the boy had questions about honor and duty, it was the Dragonknight he sought out rather than his father. They spent hours together in the training yard, in the library, walking the battlements of the Red Keep. Was this an uncle mentoring his nephew, or a father trying to shape his son, despite being unable to claim him? The realm would debate that question for generations. Even Daron's own grandson, Maester Aemon at the Wall, would acknowledge the uncertainty centuries later. "My grandfather named me for Prince Aemon the Dragonknight," he told Jon Snow, who was his uncle or his father, depending on which tale you believe. The uncertainty itself became a wound that never healed, because whether the rumors were true or false, they accomplished Aegon's goal. They tainted everyone involved. They cast doubt on the succession. They turned Aemon's greatest strength, his honor, into a question mark rather than a certainty. And then Aegon began favoring his bastard sons over his legitimate heir. He sired children on mistresses throughout the realm, and he gave them honors and gifts that should have gone to Prince Darien. Most notably, he gave his bastard Darien Waters the Valyrian steel sword Blackfire, the blade that symbolized House Targaryen's right to rule. It was a deliberate provocation. By giving Blackfire to a bastard, Aegon was suggesting that bastard might be more legitimate than his true-born son. The message was clear. If he could find a legal way to disinherit Dadoran, he would do it. And the justification would be those persistent rumors about the boy's true father. Aemon watched all this unfold with growing dread. The seeds being planted would eventually bloom into civil war, but he was powerless to stop it. His silence protected Nerys and Dadoran as much as speaking ever could, so he remained quiet, remained perfect, remained trapped in the cage of his own making. Aegon IV's court became a circus of excess that would have been entertaining if it weren't destroying lives. The king grew so fat he could barely walk, requiring servants to help him stand. He commissioned a massive wooden throne to replace the iron throne because he found the original uncomfortable. He planned impossible projects, like a bridge across the narrow sea, or new dragons carved from wood, and wasted the realm's resources on fantasies. But his true legacy was built on cruelty to those closest to him, especially Nadris and Aemon. His first great mistress was Barbara Bracken, daughter of the Hand of the King. She bore him a son, Adigor Rivers, who would later earn the name Bittersteel and become one of the most dangerous men in Westeros. Lord Bracken openly hoped Adigorn would set aside Nadris and marry his daughter, legitimizing the bastard and securing his family's position. When Nadris nearly died after giving birth to a daughter and a stillborn son, the vultures circled. If the queen died, Aegon would be free to remarry. But Nadris recovered, much to Lord Bracken's disappointment, and Aemon, along with Prince Darren, made it clear that Barbara Bracken was no longer welcome at court. They forced the king's mistress and her bastard son to leave, one of the few times Aemon directly opposed Aegon's wishes, and got away with it. The next great mistress was Melissa Blackwood, and she was different. Where Barbara had been ambitious and cruel, Melissa showed genuine kindness. She befriended Nerys rather than trying to supplant her. She treated Prince Darren with respect, and remarkably, she earned the friendship of both Aemon and the Queen. It was a strange arrangement, but in Aegon's twisted court, they found allies wherever they could. But Melissa was the exception. Most of Aegon's mistresses cared nothing for the Queen. They were humiliating. The king paraded them through court, showered them with honors and gifts, and made certain Nerys understood how little she meant to him compared to any woman who would tolerate his appetites. And there were so many bastards. 9 that history remembers as the great bastards, children born to noble women or women of unusual ability. But there were dozens more scattered throughout the realm, acknowledged by the king and given his name, if not his legitimacy. Each one was another insult to his wife, another reminder that he valued his lusts over his marriage vows. The worst of it was Daemon Blackfyre. Born to Daena Targaryen, the king's cousin, this bastard became Aegon's clear favorite. He was everything Aegon wanted. In a son, bold where Daemon was thoughtful, warlike where the prince was diplomatic, ambitious where the heir was content. Aegon showered attention on Daemon that he never gave his legitimate children. And then he gave Daemon the sword. Blackfyre, the Valyrian steel blade of Aegon the Conqueror, symbol of the Targaryen right to rule. It should have gone to Prince Darren as heir. Instead, it went to a bastard. And the message couldn't have been clearer. Aegon was saying this bastard was more worthy than his true-born son. The realm fractured along invisible lines. Some lords looked at Prince Darren and saw a good man who would make a wise king. Others looked at Daemon Blackfyre and saw a warrior who would make a strong king. And underneath those judgments lay the unspoken question, which one was actually legitimate? Because Aegon never stopped talking about his suspicions. At feasts, he would drink and loudly declare that Daeron was the Dragonknight's bastard. In council meetings, he would suggest that his heir was a cuckoo in the nest, a pretender to a throne that should go to one of his acknowledged bastards. He used the accusation as a weapon whenever Daeron opposed him, which happened with increasing frequency as the prince matured into a man who could no longer stay silent about his father's misrule. For Aemon, every day was fresh torture. As Lord Commander, he had to be present at court. He watched Aegon humiliate Nadris in 1,000 subtle and not so subtle ways. He heard the constant accusations about Darren's parentage. He saw the way courtiers looked at him, trying to determine if the rumors were true based on how he interacted with the prince. And he could do nothing. His vows required him to protect the king, not to love him, not to respect him, but to protect him from harm. Every fiber of his being wanted to put Dark Sister through Aegon's heart, but that would be kinslaying, oath-breaking, and treason all at once. It would destroy everything Aemon had built his life around. So he stood silent and perfect. He served flawlessly. He trained young knights in the Kingsguard, and taught them what it meant to uphold vows, even when every instinct screamed to break them. He became a living example of duty over desire, honor over happiness, service over self. But the cost was written in his eyes for anyone who cared to look. The songs called him the greatest knight who ever lived. Behind closed doors he was dying slowly from a wound no maester could treat. Natri suffered even more directly. She was trapped as queen with no escape. Aegon made her attend feasts where he groped his mistresses. He forced her to receive these women at court and treat them with courtesy. He spoke to her with casual contempt, belittling her piety, mocking her delicate health, suggesting she was weak and useless compared to the women who willingly shared his bed. She grew thinner, paler, more fragile with each passing year. The multiple difficult pregnancies had weakened her permanently. The constant stress and humiliation took their toll. She spent more and more time in prayer, seeking comfort from the gods, since she could find none in her marriage. And through it all, Aemon had to watch, had to see the woman he loved being destroyed slowly by the brother he despised, had to maintain his perfect facade, while everything inside him screamed. The white cloak that should have been an honor felt more like a prisoner's chains with every passing day. The realm looked at King Aegon IV and saw a fool, a glutton, a monster wearing a crown. They looked at Queen Nacerys and saw a saint suffering in silence. And they looked at Aemon the Dragonknight and saw perfection made flesh, the ideal knight serving without complaint. None of them saw the truth, that the greatest knight who ever lived was being tortured more effectively than any dungeon could accomplish. That honor could be a cage more inescapable than iron, that sometimes the cruelest punishment was forcing a good man to serve evil and calling it duty. The worst was yet to come, because Aegon wasn't done tormenting them. And his next move would force Aemon to fight for everything he loved while the entire realm watched and judged. The accusation came during a feast, though perhaps calling it a feast dignifies what had become a nightly display of excess and humiliation. Aegon sat bloated on his oversized throne, wine dripping down his multiple chins as he groped whichever mistress currently held his favor. Naerys sat beside him, pale and withdrawn, enduring another evening of public degradation. Then Sir Morgille Hostwick stood up. He was a knight of moderate reputation, skilled enough to have earned his spurs, but not legendary. What possessed him to make the accusation that night remains debated by historians. Some believe he acted on his own twisted sense of moral outrage. Others suspect Aegon himself put him up to it, tired of merely implying what he now wanted stated openly. Sir Morgille's voice cut through the feast hall. He accused Queen Naerys of adultery with Prince Aemon. He claimed Prince Daeron was a bastard born of treason and forbidden lust. He demanded the queen face judgment for her crimes. The hall went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every cup froze halfway to lips. This wasn't drunken speculation anymore. This was a formal accusation of treason, and treason carried the death penalty. Naerys went white as snow. She'd endured years of Aegon's cruel implications, but having it stated openly before the entire court was different. This was her honor, her life, her son's claim to the throne, all being challenged by a man who knew the accusation could get her executed. Aemon stood at his position near the king, and those close enough saw something terrifying flash across his face. For just a moment, the perfect knight disappeared, and something primal showed through. The rage of a man who'd endured too much for too long. The fury of someone watching the woman he loved being threatened with death for loving him back. Then the mask returned. The Dragonknight took a breath and spoke with the measured calm of a man who'd spent decades controlling himself. Under Westerosi law, accusations of treason could be settled through trial by combat. Let the gods decide who spoke truth. Nafris needed a champion to fight for her honor, someone to face Ser Morgul in single combat with her life hanging on the outcome. Aemon stepped forward and claimed that it should have been complicated. He was the accused party, after all, fighting to prove his sister's innocence when he was supposedly the one who'd betrayed his vows with her. But technically, he was her brother and a member of the Kingsguard sworn to protect the royal family. He could serve as her champion. Aegon smiled. Perhaps he'd orchestrated this exact scenario. Perhaps he'd simply seen an opportunity and seized it. Either way, he approved the combat with obvious pleasure. Let the gods sort it out. Let his brother fight and maybe die defending the woman both of them supposedly loved. The duel was set for 3 days hence. Time enough for Ser Morgul to prepare. Time enough for the entire city to learn what was happening. Time enough for King's Landing to become obsessed with the question that had haunted the court for years. Were the rumors true? Those 3 days were torture for everyone involved. Nerys barely ate, spending her time in prayer at the royal sept. Daeron, now a young man, stayed close to his mother while shooting looks of pure hatred at his father. And Aemon prepared as he always did, through training and meditation, pushing everything else away until only the combat remained. On the morning of the duel, all of King's Landing seemed to gather. Nobles packed the viewing stands. Small folk climbed walls and rooftops for a glimpse. This wasn't just about a queen's honor anymore. This was about the succession itself. If Aemon lost, Nathris would likely be executed, and Daeron disinherited as a bastard. Daemon Blackfire would probably become heir. The entire future of the realm rested on this fight. Aemon entered the lists wearing white armor over white, the Dragonknight, in full glory. Dark Sister hung at his hip, the Valyrian steel gleaming in the morning sun. He was in his 40s now, old by knightly standards, his hair showing silver that wasn't just Targaryen coloring, but his body remained hard as castle stone, and his eyes held the focus of a man who'd never lost a fight that mattered. Ser Morgul entered from the opposite side, younger, strong, and competent with a blade. He wore good armor and carried a quality sword. Under normal circumstances, he'd be considered a dangerous opponent, but these weren't normal circumstances. The combat began with traditional formality. Heralds announced the charge. Priests blessed both fighters, and then steel rang against steel. It wasn't even close. Ananan moved like he was 20 years younger. Dark Sister became a blur of Valyrian steel, attacking from angles that shouldn't exist, defending positions that seemed impossible to hold. Ser Morgul fought well. He had skill and training, but he was facing perhaps the greatest swordsman in Westerosi history, and that skill had been forged through decades of constant refinement. More than that, Aemon was fighting for everything he'd ever cared about. Every moment of suffering under Aegon's reign, every time he'd watched Nerys endure humiliation, every question about whether Daeron was his son or nephew, all of it poured into his sword work. Dark Sister found openings that didn't exist a heartbeat before. She slipped past guards that should have held. She struck with precision that turned defense into futility. Ser Morgul fought bravely, but bravery means nothing against perfection armed with Valyrian steel. The killing blow came almost as a mercy. Aemon's blade found the gap between helmet and breastplate, the vulnerable spot every knight fears. The Ser Morgul fell, and the gods had spoken through combat as the old laws required. The crowd roared. Natrys was vindicated, her honor restored by right of trial. Daeron remained legitimate heir to the Iron Throne. The accusation had been answered with blood, and by law, No one could question the outcome. Except everyone still did. Because defeating someone in combat only proves you're better with a sword. It doesn't prove innocence or guilt. It proves the gods favor the stronger fighter, or perhaps that the gods don't interfere in mortal affairs at all. The legal question was settled. The whispered doubts remained. Aegon certainly didn't change his mind. If anything, having his attempt to disgrace his wife and brother fail so publicly only deepened his resentment. He'd wanted Aemon humiliated or dead. Instead, the Dragonknight had proven once again that he was everything Aegon wasn't: skilled, honorable, beloved by the realm. Nefrys recovered from the ordeal, though it took something from her that she never got back. The public accusation, even defeated, left scars. She withdrew further from court life, spending more time in prayer and less time anywhere Aegon might find her. And Aemon returned to his duties with Dark Sister cleaned and sheathed. He'd killed a man to defend his sister's honor. Whether he'd been defending a sibling or protecting the mother of his child, only he and Naris truly knew. They never spoke of it publicly. They never confirmed or denied anything. That silence was its own kind of answer. Or perhaps it was simply the only response possible when truth and duty become so tangled that separating them would destroy everything. Years later, a member of the Kingsguard would reflect on that day. When the Dragonknight entered that trial by combat, was he the brother defending his sister's virtue, or was he the father fighting desperately to save his son's future and prevent his lover's execution? The question haunted the realm then, it haunts history now. And perhaps that's fitting, because Aemon's entire life was lived in that space between what people suspected and what could be proven, between the vows he'd taken and the love he might have felt, between the duty he showed the world and the truth he kept locked away. He'd won the trial, he'd saved Naris and Daeron, but victory in combat couldn't kill the questions. It couldn't restore what had been taken from them. It couldn't make any of this right. It could only prove, once again, that Aemon was the greatest swordsman alive. And in the twisted logic of his existence, being the greatest at what he did meant absolutely nothing compared to what he couldn't have. Somewhere during his years of service, Aemon faced Lord Cregan Stark in single combat. The exact circumstances have been lost to time, which is itself remarkable given how thoroughly documented the Dragonknight's life became. Perhaps it was a tournament, perhaps a matter of honor. What matters is that these two legendary warriors, separated by thousands of miles and completely different worlds, met with swords in hand. Cregan Stark was a northern lord of the old school, hard as winter, skilled with blade and strategy, a man who'd briefly served as Hand of the King, and given up that power voluntarily when his work was done. He was everything the North valued: strength without show, honor without ornament, duty without complaint. In many ways, he and Aemon should have been natural allies. They understood each other in ways that softer men never could. Both had sacrificed personal desire for duty. Both had served without expecting reward. Both had lived by codes that demanded everything and gave back very little. The duel became legendary, not because of its outcome, but because of what Aemon said afterward. He'd fought some of the finest knights in Westeros. He'd defeated champions from every corner of the realm. He'd wielded Dark Sister against hundreds of opponents across decades of combat. And he said that Cregan Stark was the finest swordsman he'd ever faced. Coming from anyone else, it might have been diplomatic flattery, but Aemon didn't do flattery. He spoke truth even when it cost him. So, when he said Cregan was the best, people believed him. The fact that Aemon had won the duel only made the compliment more meaningful. He'd faced the best and barely triumphed. That fight marked something, though. A recognition that even the greatest have limits, that perfection isn't the same as invincibility. that somewhere out there, someone exists who can match you, and you survive as much through fortune as through skill. Aemon was getting older. The white cloak he'd worn since 17 now draped the shoulders of a man in his 40s. His hair showed more silver. His face carried lines that hadn't been there a decade before. The years of constant training and combat had left their marks, old wounds that ached in cold weather, scars that told stories he rarely shared. But he remained Lord Commander. He remained the standard against which all other knights measured themselves, and he remained trapped in service to a king he despised. Aegon grew worse with age rather than better. As his body failed him, his personality turned even more spiteful. He could barely walk without help. He wheezed when he spoke. His health was destroying itself through excess, and he responded by indulging even harder in everything that was killing him. His treatment of Nerys never softened. If anything, watching her maintain dignity while he descended into decay seemed to enrage him further. She was dying slowly too, her body worn out from difficult pregnancies and constant stress, but she faced her decline with grace while he fought his with spite. The gap between Prince Daeron and his father widened into a chasm. The young man openly opposed his father's policies. He befriended people Aegon despised. He treated his mother with the respect and love his father denied her, and he spent time with Aemon learning everything the Dragonknight could teach him about honor and duty and what it meant to rule justly. Daemon Blackfire grew into a formidable warrior in his own right. Carrying the sword that bore his name, he attracted followers who believed a strong bastard made a better king than a weak legitimate heir. Never mind that Daeron wasn't weak, merely thoughtful. The battle lines were being drawn for a conflict that wouldn't erupt until after everyone involved was dead. Aemon watched all this with growing dread. He could see the future taking shape. When Aegon died, Daeron would take the throne, but Daemon and his followers would challenge that succession, using the questions about Daeron's parentage as justification. The realm would tear itself apart in civil war, and it would all stem from those persistent doubts about whether a Kingsguard had broken his vows. There was nothing he could do to prevent it. Speaking out would only make things worse. The silence hadn't stopped the rumors. Truth or lies, it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, the seeds planted. All that remained was watching them grow into something that would eventually destroy thousands of lives. His role as Lord Commander meant training the next generation of Kingsguard. He taught them what he'd learned through decades of service, how to stand watch for hours without moving, how to serve faithfully even when your king doesn't deserve it, how to keep vows when breaking them would be so much easier. Some of them understood, others just saw an old knight who'd gotten lucky with his reputation. They didn't grasp that every day of Aemon's perfection had cost him something, that the white cloak wasn't a reward, it was a price paid continuously without end. He was tired, not physically, though his body carried the accumulated damage of a lifetime of combat, but tired in his soul, tired of serving Aegon, tired of watching Nerys suffer, tired of the questions and whispers, tired of being perfect when perfection had brought him nothing but pain. But he couldn't stop, because stopping meant abandoning everything he'd built his life around. It meant admitting the last 30 years had been wasted. It meant accepting that honor was meaningless, and duty was a trap for fools. So he kept going, kept serving, kept standing guard, kept being the Dragonknight, even though the man inside that legend was dying by inches. And he waited for the end, knowing it would come sooner rather than later, knowing that when it did, he'd face it the same way he'd faced everything else, with Dark Sister in hand, and his vows intact, no matter what they'd cost him. The execution of Ser Terence Toyne was excessive even by Aegon's standards. Terence had been a knight of the Kingsguard, sworn to the same vows Aemon had lived by for decades. but he'd fallen in love with one of Aegon's mistresses, not even a current favorite, but a woman the king had already discarded and moved on from. When Aegon discovered the affair, he didn't simply dismiss Terence from the Kingsguard or even execute him cleanly. He had the knight fed to his dogs, literally torn apart by hounds while still alive, dying in agony and terror as punishment for touching something Aegon considered his property, even though he'd thrown it away. It was cruelty without purpose beyond cruelty itself. It was the act of a monster who wore a crown, and it turned even Aegon's supporters' stomachs. But the king was the king. No one could stop him except the Kingsguard sworn to protect him, and they wouldn't raise a hand against the man they'd vowed to serve. Terence Toyne had brothers. They came to King's Landing not for justice, because there was no justice to be had from Aegon IV, but for vengeance. They came to kill the king who'd murdered their brother for the crime of loving someone who returned that love. The details of how they infiltrated the Red Keep remain unclear. Perhaps they bribed guards. Perhaps they had help from nobles who'd grown sick of Aegon's reign. Perhaps they simply knew the castle well enough to find the gaps in its security. However they managed it, they got close to the king. Aemon was there. As Lord Commander, he was always there. The standing watch while Aegon ate himself sick. Standing guard while the king debauched himself with whichever woman currently held his attention. Standing silent and perfect while everything inside him screamed to walk away and let whatever happened. When the Toyne brothers revealed themselves and drew their weapons, Aemon's body reacted before his mind could finish processing. Decades of training and instinct took over. Dark Sister left her sheath in a whisper of Valyrian steel, and the Dragonknight placed himself between the assassins and his king. There's a moment here worth examining. A space between heartbeats where Aemon could have chosen differently. He could have hesitated just slightly, could have been a fraction slower, could have let the brothers strike their blow before intervening. Aegon dead would have solved so many problems. Nadris would be free. Daeron could take the throne without the shadow of doubt. The nightmare could finally end. But that choice wasn't available to Aemon. Not really, because he'd spent 30 years building his identity around his vows. His honor wasn't something he wore like armor that could be removed when convenient. It was the foundation of everything he'd become. Remove it, and the entire structure collapsed. So he defended the king. Not because Aegon deserved defending, not because he loved his brother, or respected him, or even thought the realm was better with him alive, but because the vows demanded it, and Aemon had never broken a vow. The combat was brutal. Two skilled fighters with murder in their hearts against one legendary knight in his 40s. Under normal circumstances, Aemon would have ended this quickly. But these weren't normal circumstances. The years had taken their toll. He was slower than he'd been at 20, his body carrying the accumulated damage of decades of warfare. And perhaps some part of him was tired of fighting, tired of serving, tired of living this half-life where duty replaced happiness and honor was its own punishment. Dark Sister sang her last song in Aemon's hands. She found throats and hearts with the precision of a lifetime's mastery. She opened arteries and shattered bone. She proved one final time that the Dragonknight remained the deadliest warrior in Westeros. But the Toyne brothers wounded him. Steel found gaps in his armor. Blades bit into flesh. Blood ran down white metal, staining the symbol of purity with red reality. When the fight ended, the Toyne brothers lay dead or dying, and Aemon stood swaying. Dark Sister still gripped in hands that were losing strength. He'd done it. He'd saved the king. He'd fulfilled his duty one last time. Then his legs gave out. He collapsed, and the blood that had been flowing became a flood. The wounds were mortal. Every maester in the Red Keep could see it. He was dying. They carried him to his quarters. laid him on a bed he'd rarely slept in, because Lord Commanders sleep in shifts, always alert, always ready. The white cloak pooled around him, soaked through with blood that should have stayed inside his body. Aegon came to see him, whether from gratitude, curiosity, or just to gloat that even the perfect Dragonknight could die. No one recorded. History doesn't tell us what words passed between them, if any. Did Aegon thank the brother he'd tormented for decades? Did he mock him even at the end? Did they finally speak truth to each other without the weight of court watching? We don't know. Perhaps that's mercy. Some moments are too private, too painful to be preserved. Nerys came. That much is certain. She sat beside the bed and took his hand. And damn what anyone thought about it, he was dying. Her brother, or her lover, or both, or neither. None of it mattered anymore. He protected her for 30 years. She would sit with him at the end. What did they say to each other? Did Aemon finally admit what he'd felt? Did Nerys confess the truth about Daeron? Did they find some measure of peace? Or did they maintain the silence they'd kept for decades? The histories don't record those final words. Perhaps they were never meant to be recorded. Perhaps the only people who needed to hear them were the two people in that room. Prince Daeron came too. The young man who might have been nephew or son sat with the knight who might have been uncle or father. Did Aemon tell him to be strong, to be the king? Aegon never was. Did Daeron ask the question that haunted him? Did he finally learn the truth? Or did Aemon take that secret to whatever comes after? We'll never know. What we do know is that Aemon Targaryen, the Dragonknight, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, died from wounds received defending King Aegon IV. He died in service. He died with his vows intact. He died having never publicly admitted to breaking them, or never having broken them at all, depending on which version you believe. Dark Sister was cleaned and passed on. The white cloak was given to his successor, and Aemon's body was prepared for burial with all the honors due a legendary knight. He'd spent his entire adult life trapped between duty and desire. He'd chosen honor over happiness every single day, and he died protecting the man who'd made his life hell, because that's what his vows required. The songs would call it noble. History would call it tragic. The truth was probably both, and neither. It was simply the end of a man who tried to be perfect and discovered that perfection is just another word for suffering you've learned to hide. Nerys followed him into death within the year. Some accounts say she died shortly before Aemon. Others claim she lingered just long enough to know he was gone. The exact timeline matters less than the reality. Whatever had sustained her through decades of suffering disappeared when Aemon did. Her body, already worn to nothing by difficult pregnancies and constant stress, simply gave up. Aegon outlived them both, which feels like one final cosmic cruelty. He didn't mourn his brother or his wife. Instead, he spent his remaining time attempting to destroy their reputations. He spoke even more openly about Daeron being a bastard. He elevated his acknowledged bastards to positions of power, and on his deathbed in 184, he legitimized all of them, creating a succession crisis that would haunt the realm for a century. That deathbed legitimization was Aegon's final act of spite. By making his bastards legally equal to his true-born children, he gave Daemon Blackfyre and the others a technical claim to the throne. He was planting seeds of civil war that would bloom after he was safely dead. King Daeron II took the throne in 184. Everything his father had been, he was not. Thoughtful where Aegon was impulsive. Kind where his father was cruel. He finally brought dawn into the Seven Kingdoms through marriage rather than conquest, accomplishing peacefully what 2 centuries of warfare had failed to achieve. But he ruled under a shadow. Those questions about his parentage never disappeared. Roughly half the realm believed he was Aegon's legitimate son. The other half believed he was Aemon's bastard, and that division became the fault line along which the realm would crack. Daemon Blackfyre waited 12 years. He gathered supporters who believed a warrior bastard made a better king than a peaceful heir. He carried the sword Blackfyre, symbol of Targaryen legitimacy. He had the loyalty of his half-brother, Aegor Bittersteel, one of the finest military commanders of the age. In 196, Daemon raised his banner in rebellion. The realm exploded into civil war. Brother fought brother. Houses split down the middle as lords chose between Daeron or Daemon, between Red Dragon or Black. The first Blackfyre rebellion ended at the Battle of Redgrass Field, where Daemon died with his sons around him. But it didn't end there. 4 more Blackfyre rebellions would follow over the next 50 years. Thousands died in each one. The realm bled itself in conflicts that all traced back to one question: was Daeron II the son of Aegon IV, or the son of Aemon the Dragonknight? Aemon had died trying to prevent exactly this. His silence was meant to protect Naris, and Daeron, his perfect service, was supposed to prove his honor. But honor doesn't stop civil wars. Duty doesn't prevent rebellions, and questions left unanswered become weapons in the hands of ambitious men. The cruel irony is that whether the rumors were true or false almost doesn't matter. The damage came from the uncertainty itself. If Daeron was absolutely Aegon's son, it changed nothing. The doubt existed. Men willing to kill for power used those questions as justification for treason. But if the rumors were true, then Aemon had broken the most sacred vows a knight could take. He'd fathered a bastard and let him inherit the Iron Throne. Generations of warfare stemmed from that moment. And if the rumors were false, then Aemon had endured decades of accusation for nothing. He'd suffered in silence to protect honor he'd never violated. He'd lived in a cage he built to contain guilt he didn't carry. We'll never know which version is true. Years after the last Blackfyre rebellion finally ended, an old man sat at Castle Black, wearing the black of the Night's Watch. Maester Aemon, great-great-grandson of Daeron II, named after his legendary ancestor. When Jon Snow mentioned the Dragonknight, the old maester said something that cut to the heart of everything. My grandfather named me for Prince Aemon the Dragonknight, who was his uncle or his father, depending on which tale you believe. Even generations later, even within the family, the question remained. And in that uncertainty lies the real legacy. The songs remember him as the greatest knight who ever lived. They sing about his skill with Dark Sister, his victory over the Dornish champion, his survival of the Viper Pit, his trial by combat defending his sister's honor. They romanticize the Knight of Tears who defied his king to crown the woman he loved. But the songs lie by omission. They leave out the daily torture of serving Aegon. They gloss over the reality that honor without happiness is just another form of death. They make his cage seem like a throne. The histories debate what made Aemon great. Was it his unmatched skill, his unwavering service, his willingness to sacrifice everything for duty? Different scholars emphasize different aspects, but they all agree he was extraordinary. Yet greatness came at a cost measured in decades of quiet suffering. He never had the life he might have wanted. Never married for love, if he loved at all, beyond Nerys. Never fathered children he could acknowledge, if he fathered any. Never found peace or happiness, or any of the simple joys that make life worth living. He had duty, he had honor, he had vows kept perfectly for 30 years, and he had nothing else. Some argue he was noble, others say he was a fool. Some claim he was an adulterer who broke his vows. Others insist he was perfectly innocent. The arguments continue centuries later because the questions he left behind matter more than the answers. What is certain is this: Aemon Targaryen wielded Dark Sister with unmatched skill. He served 5 kings with absolute dedication. He saved lives, won battles, defended the innocent, and embodied everything the Kingsguard was supposed to represent. And he was miserable, trapped in a life he'd chosen but couldn't escape. Loving a woman he couldn't have, serving a brother he despised, dying to protect someone who deserved death more than protection. Perhaps that's what makes him great. Not that he was happy serving, not that duty fulfilled him, but that he kept going anyway. Day after day, year after year, he maintained his standards when lowering them would have been easier. He never complained, never broke, never let the mask slip in public. He was the Dragonknight from the moment he took the white cloak until the moment he died wearing it. Dark Sister passed through other hands after his death. She served other warriors, saw other battles, eventually disappeared into history, but she never found another wielder quite like Aemon. The songs will never die. Children in Westeros still hear stories about the Dragonknight centuries after his death. They learn about honor and duty and keeping vows even when it costs everything. What they're not taught is whether being the greatest was worth the price he paid, whether honor matters if it destroys you, whether keeping vows is noble when those vows trap you in hell. He did what he thought was right. He served faithfully. He protected those he was sworn to protect, even when they didn't deserve protection. He maintained standards that would have broken lesser men, and he died having never publicly admitted to anything that would tarnish the legend. Somewhere his bones have turned to dust. Dark Sister is lost to history. The white cloak rotted away centuries ago. Even the Red Keep, where he spent most of his life, has changed beyond recognition. But the questions remain. The legend persists about duty and desire, about honor and happiness, about what we owe to others and what we owe to ourselves. The Dragonknight is sleeping now, has been for centuries, but his story refuses to rest. It lives in songs and histories and arguments that will continue long after we're all dust ourselves. What makes a man great? His deeds or his sacrifices? Aemon chose sacrifice. Every day for 30 years he chose it. Whether that was wisdom or tragedy, honor or waste, nobility or foolishness depends entirely on who you ask. The only certainty is this: he was the Dragonknight, and the realm will never see his like again.